Hi, everyone. Welcome to the February 6th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host, Craig Milkowski, and got a long rundown this week, many races to talk about, and a lot of three-year-old action. That's no surprise. There were 4 Kentucky Derby prep races offering qualifying points taking place last Saturday, all being run sort of in a cluster on Saturday afternoon. The Holy Bull in Florida, the Robert B. Lewis out in California, the Southwest at Oaklawn, and the Withers at Aqueduct. We're going to talk about all of those, as well as other stakes action from around the country this past weekend. Plenty of other three-year-old races, including stakes at Gulfstream, some maiden and allowance performances from elsewhere. So a lot of the docket today, Craig, and it feels like this three-year-old picture, it's starting to generate conversation, but I don't know if it's exactly taking shape just yet, because it seems like there's still a whole lot of uncertainty out there.
Is the word I would use. I mean, if anything, it's more muddled after last week's racing than it was before it, which generally isn't the case. But yeah, there were some very surprising results, to say the least. Some good performances, a couple that weren't so great in my opinion, but we'll get into that as we go through the races.
Yeah, and I think we'll start off by talking about those 4 Derby prep races right at the top of the show. Usually go track by track. We'll do that for some of the other races later, but I think it makes sense to talk about all of these Derby prep races as a unit to kind of offer up some comparisons if we can at this very early stage. That's difficult to do with these horses being so lightly raced. But Craig, let's start off, and I think it makes sense to begin with the Holy Bull, since that's where last year's 2-year-old champion Fierceness made his 3-year-old debut, and a shocking loss here. Obviously went off as the heavy favorite and just seemed kind of dull and empty late in his 3-year-old unveiling. And the undefeated Hades took yet another step forward to win this race, a horse who had definitely shown potential in the first couple starts of his career, but I think most people just assumed that this was going to be an easy test for fierceness to pass as he began his march towards the Florida Derby and then on to the Run for the Roses. But now it seems like those plans are a little bit up in the air. As for the way this Holy Bull was run, Craig, obviously did not come back the fastest race. I mean, just in terms of final time, anybody can see that. The track was not playing fast at Gulfstream on Saturday, but 146 and change for a mile and a 16th is slow. The pace had a lot to do with that. And I know you want to talk a little bit about that with regard to how that impacts the speed figure.
Yeah, it was definitely not the fastest race. It was the only 2-turn race on the card, but there were some dirt sprints run. And as you mentioned, it was not a fast track, but I think the pace more than anything held this final time down. We wound up giving it a 107 final time figure because of the pace. It was adjusted down to a 105 for Hades. Yeah, so not great. I mean, it's hard to be excited about that for a horse on the Triple Crown Trail. I know he's undefeated and hasn't done anything wrong, but you want to see these horses run faster than this. As for Fierceness, I think there's some very real concerns here. He's been brilliant in 2 starts and pretty terrible in 2 starts. And the 2 times he hasn't run well are races where he didn't really get out of the gate very well. He seems to be a horse that is a little bit headstrong to me and probably wants to be on the lead. And when he wasn't able to make it due to how he broke, things just went wrong from there. It's the horse was 1-5. You don't want to give too many excuses, but it was far from an ideal trip for him. But I think a lot of that's due to was from his own making.
Yeah, and as far as that speed figure goes, I know that there was some chatter on social media because the Bayer team put out a statement that they were upgrading their initial figure a little bit. I think they first gave the race, I think, an 84, 85, and they upgraded it to a 90 Bayer. Your number is kind of right in between those two, Craig, at least in terms of the final time figure in TimeformUS. And with disregarding the pace adjustment, I know you use very similar methods to the Bayer team, and you were kind of defending that decision a little bit because it's just a tough speed figure to make. I mean, in terms of how fast this group really is, I think a lot of that depends on how much we think Fierceness really regressed in this race, because it kind of stands to reason that the rest of the field improved a little bit. How much did they improve? That kind of is up to debate. I know one reason why it makes sense to upgrade the figure a little bit is because there was some uncertainty around Hades' last race coming into this, and I recall when I was handicapping this race, this was one that you had the B notation for, in that it was a breakout race on the day. I'm talking about Hades' December 31st allowance win, and I'm seeing in the chart now that both you and Bayer have since upgraded that fig, and it's something, of course, you want to do looking back in retrospect when you see horses run back out of that race.
Yeah, it's not one of those things we like to do. I can't speak for the buyer team, but I'm sure they don't like to do it. We want to get figures right the first time. But the day that he won that last race, it was a day where it was 3 races on the card on the dirt. They were all sprints. They were all for 2-year-olds. There was just very, very little to go on. And I didn't do the card, but I would have probably came to the same conclusion my assistant did. I mean, it's just really tough to do when races are carded that way. We do the best we can, but it was 100 at the time. I upgraded it to a 108. I did the whole card over again, looking at how all the horses in all 3 races have run since that day. And now we have more information, so hopefully a better figure. It's not one of those cases where suddenly the horse would have had a figure where he was competitive with fierceness. He was not. I mean, even that 108 was nowhere near his Breeders' Cup Juvenile win. So it's not one that you could look back and say, oh, if I knew this horse ran a 108 instead of 100, I probably would have bet him. I mean, I like that we give that B notation to let you know there was probably some tough things going on that day. And basically, it was one of the tougher ones you're going to see. So we went ahead and made the change.
Yeah, and I believe I even talked about that when I did my preview of the race last week, explaining that B notation and how that could have been a faster race. And I think it turned out that it was, and you made the right call in retrospect. And, you know, I just laugh at some of these people on social media who, when any speed figure maker puts out an adjustment, are kind of like, gotcha, the figs are obviously made up. You're just upgraded the number because Fierceness is in the race. No, as Craig was just explaining, there's limited evidence in some of these situations. The horses are lightly raced. There aren't that many dirt races to compare them to. And the figure makers are just doing the best they can. And unfortunately, there is some subjectivity built into the numbers, even though you would prefer that there isn't. There's just a limited set of data to base them off of. So you have to use a little bit of your experience and opinion. And once more data comes in, then you go back and make revisions and feel more confident about the numbers moving forward. And if you want the speed figures to be a sound handicapping tool, that's what figure makers should be doing. So when people criticize them for that, it's just, I mean, it's just totally counterintuitive, and people are so off the mark and not understanding how speed figures are generated. Just had to get that off my chest. But as far as this holy bull, Craig, you know, the major discussion is around fierceness. I mean, obviously, Hades is a horse with some talent, and he's moving in the right direction. And it was nice to see him put this field away and finish as strongly as he did. You know, he is a horse that seems like, at a distance, as his friend. I noticed in that allowance victory back in December that he was a horse who seemed like he really found more when he changed leads and switched over to his right lead, something that he had not done in his career debut. And again, he changed leads on cue in this Holy Bull, and just seems like a horse that runs the straightaways a lot better than he does the turns. But something that really struck me watching the stretch run of this race as they turned for home is that Hades just kind of towered over fierceness from a stature standpoint. And he is a bit of a high-headed horse, but he just has more substance to him. And, you know, watching fierceness and seeing how physically he didn't quite stack up against this competition in this race. And I know that's something that you know, the Naira paddock analyst Maggie Wolfendale even talked about last year, that he's just not the biggest horse. I mean, she was even skeptical of him handling some tougher company in the Champagne when horses like Timberlake and General Partner just looked more developed than he did at that time. And obviously he disappointed that day. Now, the real fierceness showed up in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, but let's remember, the Breeders' Cup Juvenile was a race that was run at a fairly moderate pace. It mostly held together on the front end, and he got a perfect trip that day, just perched on the outside in the clear the whole way. As you said, he had some trouble at the start here, bounced around a little bit. John Velasquez had to get after him a little bit to secure that position, stalking outside, heading into the clubhouse turn, but I mean, Craig, he was rushing up into a 25-second opening quarter, so I don't know how much rushing there really was to do. And he had every chance after that and just kind of went backwards at the top of the stretch. And for me, a horse that can't overcome even minor adversity like that, That's a really bad sign for a horse pointing towards the Kentucky Derby, where you're likely to encounter some adversity.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at, and that I think a lot of the problems were of his own doing, and he seems to be a horse that doesn't handle adversity well. It's still early. Todd Pletcher is a great trainer, as we all know. Maybe he can get things sorted out, but more often than not, that doesn't work out, and it's something that horses really don't overcome. So it will be interesting. I should mention Todd Pletcher didn't have the greatest record coming in this particular race. He's been beaten at short prices before, and I doubt this horse was fully cranked up. So the speed figure probably doesn't mean much. The issues that I saw that cropped up again mean more to me.
Yeah, no, I think we didn't mention domestic product. I mean, he finished well for second, showed some mental maturity in this race. And I guess you could say he arguably flattered the Remsen from last year. We saw some other runbacks out of that race this weekend, but still is just was not the fastest race overall. So I don't want to get too excited about this Holy Bull. A horse that I think we can fairly rightly get excited about, Craig, is the winner of the Robert B. Lewis out in Southern California. And that was the Bob Baffert trade Nisos, who took his undefeated record to 3 for 3 now. And this horse, I don't know how good he could turn out to be. I mean, he's just untested in 3 career starts. What really strikes me about him, Craig, is that he looked like such a speedball in that debut. I mean, they had the blinkers on. He was ridden aggressively from the start to take the lead and just ran that race like a pure sprinter. But since then, he's just mentally matured in each start. I mean, they rated him a little bit in the one-turn Bob Hope, finished that race strongly. And then here, they took him off the pace, sat behind rivals, wheeled out at the top of the stretch, and he handled it all like a seasoned professional and still was geared down at the end of this race. And you can talk about the speed figure. I mean, this was another track that was not playing particularly fast at Santa Anita on Saturday, and he ran a respectable time and beat some horses who had already run some nice speed figures, unlike the competition that showed up in the Holy Bull. So Niso seems like the most talented 3-year-old out there right now, and I guess we'll talk about the situation around him in a little bit. But he's a really good horse.
Yes, very good. And I was impressed with exactly what you were. He's a horse who now rated in behind horses. And when he started to make his move, it was really obvious that the race was over. Yeah, I mean, some of the horses have run some nice speed figures. Who knows really what was in there? His stablemate was second. But I would say, yeah, it was probably a better field than the Holy Bull. But the way he ran, who really cares? I mean, he was super fast, ran a 125. That was even knocked down a point. Just with the way the algorithm works from a 126 final time. And the way he did it, I mean, it's hard to argue he's not the best 3-year-old out there right now.
Yeah, I mean, he's just a horse that seems like one of those rare talents that comes along, and Bob Baffert seems to have a lot of those. But Bob Baffert also has a lot of the most expensive yearlings and 2-year-olds that are sold in the country every single season. So I guess it's not a big surprise when he winds up with the best 3-year-olds. He just working coming into this race, Craig, because I was handicapping this Robert B. Lewis. I was watching some of his morning drills, and he, especially in the workouts, was just giving me the vibe of like an American Pharaoh kind of talent, and the way that he was handling his workmates. His last workout coming into this was in company with Reincarnate, that 4-year-old who doesn't always show up on the racetrack with his top performances, but is a good workhorse in the morning. And I mean, Nisos just produced this turn of foot to run away from him like no 3-year-old I've seen in this crop. I mean, he's just displaying kind of talent that we just haven't seen from others. So they're probably not going to be in much of a rush with him now. I mean, there's no Kentucky Derby on the horizon with the current rules in place imposed by Churchill Downs and the fact that Bob Baffert's owners have stuck with him this year. So that's not going to be the goal, but there are plenty of other major 3-year-old races down the line, whether it be the Preakness, the Belmont, or both, and then summer targets. So we're going to see this horse run in some big races. Just he's not going to be on the Derby trail.
No, for sure. And I saw a lot of lamenting that there should be an asterisk placed on the Derby, and it's way too early for that kind of talk, in my opinion. It still was just a mile race. A mile and a quarter could be different. Yes, he's the best horse right now, and to be fair, they could have put him in a different barn if the owners wanted to. It's not like the horse itself is banned from the Kentucky Derby, so that kind of talk just seems silly to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I understand different perspectives. I understand the perspective of Bob Baffert's owners who feel like the goalposts have been moved multiple times by Churchill Downs, and they invest a lot of money in this game, and they're just sick of being jerked around, and they're going to stick with Bob Baffert this year and kind of say, too bad, Churchill. And I think the owners of Nysos can probably that's something that they're just gonna have to live with if they're not going to run this horse in the Kentucky Derby. And it sounds like now they've given up that chance. But there are plenty of other big 3-year-old races out there. And if Churchill is fine with not having Bob Baffert participate in this Kentucky Derby, hopefully the fact that they've laid the legal cases to rest and that this season is going to play out the way that Churchill wants it to without Bob Baffert participating. Hopefully, after this 2024 Kentucky Derby, we can move on from this entire story and just lay it to rest, because I'm kind of tired of talking about it and I'm tired of hearing all the takes on it. So I'll be happy when this season is over and we can have some new stories to talk about on the Triple Crown Trail.
Yeah, hopefully we will. I'm in your camp there, tired of talking about it, as we both said in the past.
Let's move on to a Derby prep that I think produced some different reactions depending on your perspective. The Grade 3 Southwest at Oaklawn, which was won in surprisingly impressive fashion by Mystic Dan. Handicapping the race coming in, it certainly did not seem like the kind of race that a horse was going to draw off and win by 8 lengths. But Mystic Dan put in that kind of dominant effort. I would say that the trip had a lot to do with it, Craig, but this is clearly a horse that has a lot of talent when things go his way.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it was a great ride by Brian Hernandez, saved all the ground, got through on the rail. But when you win by 8 lengths, I mean, it's hard to argue you weren't the best horse. He ran a 1:17 TimeformUS speed figure. The pace was, I guess I would say, moderate. It certainly wasn't slow, but one of the fractions is coded in blue at 6 furlongs. And that's just about the point that Mystic Dan really started to make his move. And boy, did he blow the field away. It wasn't a whole lot in behind him. I mean, Just Steel, who had run second in the Smarty Jones, ran second again here, ran a good solid race. So I think the number makes sense, especially when I look through the chart. Most of the horses ran similar numbers to what they've been doing before. It was just a really nice step forward for Mystic Dan. And the Smarty Jones, that was a race we talked about. It was a race that had, even though none of the fractions were in red, it was a strong contested pace that day, and one that the horses who were up on the lead have come back to run well.
Yeah, this horse, I mean, the run that he put in through the final quarter mile, it's a visual that you're not used to seeing on the Derby trail. I mean, just the turnover and the reach on this horse's stride, it was almost like a horse sprinting to the finish of a turf race. I mean, the way that he was sort of moving his legs just faster than everybody else coming to the finish line. And clearly he appreciated the going, the sloppy track and the sealed surface. It just seemed to really work for this horse. Beyond that, though, Craig, watching especially the last half of this card at Oaklawn Park on Saturday, I have the strong suspicion that there was an extreme rail bias at Oaklawn. And we'll talk about some of the other races on this podcast rundown, a couple other stakes where I think it kind of confirms that. But he was one of the only horses in the race that was just glued to that rail path the entire way around. And even Brian Hernandez, I think, was saying after the race that was sort of his plan. He felt like that was the place to be. And he just immediately wanted to get this horse down there. And you could see coming out of the starting gate, I mean, he made a bit of a daring move, but just made that beeline right from the rail from post 10. And it worked out for him. He stayed there and the horse clearly got over that footing down towards the inside. I know this has happened at Oaklawn before, where when they get rain and they seal the track, there's just this pronounced rail bias. I remember it. I think it was 2018 Southwest Day. It was the year that my boy Jack won coming up the rail. I think people might remember, I believe it was the Razorback from that same card where that older horse Hawakam came up the rail under Corey Lannery. It was a very Calvin Burrell-esque ride. And those kind of rides seem to really work at Oaklawn when the track is sealed on days like this. And it obviously benefited Mystic Dan. As for the others in behind, I'm not sure exactly what to make of it. I think if you're going to believe that bias scenario, then Just Steel ran really well. He was wide around the track every step of the way. I don't know how far he wants to go, but I thought he really put in a strong effort here. And then the third place finisher, Liberal Arts, he was another one that was riding the rail for a lot of his trip until they came to the stretch where he angled out. At least he was finishing, though, whereas a lot of these were just spitting their wheels through the lane. He was the one that was really running down the outside part of the track in the late stages. And actually, if you watch the gallop out of this race, Liberal Arts seemed like he was just hitting his best stride across the finish line, and he galloped out past Mystic Dan, who had built up all the momentum coming to the finish. So those are a couple. Liberal Arts in particular is one that I think you might want to continue looking for down the line based on the way that he ran here. As for others, I don't know how much of an excuse I want to make for them, Craig, because even if they were against the pace or the track profile, the horses who were fourth and lower lost this race by 17 lengths or so.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think the track was biased. Unfortunately, it's one of those where they had different track conditions. So we don't do a track bias rating for this. I don't even know if it would have caught it because it wasn't so much a speed bias. It was an inside bias. So it's just one of those. I think you could find some trips, but throughout the card. But like you mentioned, I'm not really sure this is one of those races because the margins were just so big. It sounds like, and I tend to agree, I would think maybe Mystic Dam will be a little bit overrated coming out of this one based on the margin at the wire. And yeah, it's hard for me to get too excited about this group. Unfortunately, it wasn't off track, and I would imagine we'll see some of these, particularly the Ken, with the winner being by Ken McPeak trained. I would assume we're going to see him back in the Rebel because if there's one thing we know about him, he's not afraid to run his horses.
Yeah, this is one where I would not disagree with Ken McPeak if he had the idea that this was a better horse for the St. James Palace at Royal Ascot than for the Kentucky Derby, because watching Mystic Dan stride through the stretch, I mean, he just seems like a horse that has a turn of foot and speed. Watching a horse come through the stretch like he did, I don't get the vibe of a Derby horse, but maybe I'll be wrong about it. I'm very skeptical of this one moving forward, but it's just hard to know what to make of this race as a whole, given the result and the fashion in which the winner won. Let's talk about the final Derby prep on our rundown from last weekend. That was the Grade 3 Withers. Another race that I believe was run over a significantly biased racetrack. It seems like the rail has been good for a number of weeks now at Aqueduct, and through rainstorms and different weather events, it seems like it's just continued to crop up that the rail is the place to be, and it definitely seemed that way on Saturday, even though the track was wet. So I believe Uncle Heavy was the best horse, even though the margin was very close at the end between he and the runner-up, El Grandeo. El Grandeo got the perfect trip over that track, being forward and on the rail the entire way, and Uncle Heavy was out wide around the far the clubhouse turn, was still 2 to 3 wide around the far turn, and was able to finish off this race best of anybody. So I don't know how good any of these horses are coming out of the Withers, but he ran the best race.
I'd agree. He was the only horse I would want out of this race. I mean, El Grandeo is fine. I think the bias probably helped him get the 1 1/8 as well as he did, but I really don't think he's a horse that wants to go that far. The rest in behind, I just wasn't very impressed with. The third place finisher, Lightline, who went off the favorite. I didn't see a whole bunch of an excuse for him. He ran fine, but the speed figure for this race didn't come out back all that well. Just a 108 for Uncle Heavy. And if any horse you would want to upgrade out of here, I think it would be him as opposed to the others. And a 108's a long way from being a Derby contender.
Yeah, he obviously has to improve again. It sounds like the connections are going to wait for the Wood Memorial, trying to keep him around 2 turns, which definitely seems like it's a better configuration for him than the 1-turn Gotham, which is the next race, the Kentucky Derby path in New York. So we'll see if Uncle Heavy can take another step forward. He had been a work in progress in his prior starts at Park, so he definitely seems like one that's on an upward trajectory, but where his ceiling lies, how good of a race was this Withers, I think those are questions that still need to be answered. Let's move on to some other stakes, and we'll go track by track through the rest of the show. Let's wrap up Gulfstream first, Craig, where they had plenty of other 3-year-old stakes action on Saturday, including a couple of stakes on the dirt, going shorter 7 furlong events for the females and males. The Grade 3 Forward Gal for the 3-year-old fillies was won by R. Harper Rose, who had shown ability last year as a 2-year-old. She's now 4 for 5 in her career. Her lone loss came when they tried to go 2 turns with her. She's 4 for 4 in the 1-turn races up to 7 furlongs, which is the distance that she won over on Saturday. None of these stakes events at Gulfstream came up particularly fast, and I'll be somewhat surprised if any of these Forward Gal horses turn out to be true Kentucky Oaks types.
No, me too. I mean, she ran a 103 Timeform US speed figure, R. Harper Rose. She did it easily. She seems like a pure sprinter to me. I mean, she's won all 4 of her sprints by open lengths. Didn't get the mile and a 16th the time she tried as a heavy favorite in one of those Florida bred series, I believe it was. And yeah, this race was just okay. And no Oaks implications for me. It's not like anybody in behind was really doing anything noteworthy.
Yeah, the horse that was a bit of a disappointment in this race was Scalable, who had finished decently to be 5th in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies last year, but just seems like that crop is what didn't seem fast at the time, and that race has not proven to be any faster as horses have continued to run back out of it. Let's move on to the Swale, which these days is an ungraded stakes race. This one going that same 7 furlong distance for the 3-year-old males. And an upset here, Craig, really, in terms of the top 2 or top 3, as Prices just dominated this race, won by the longest shot in the field, Frankie's Empire, who went off at 14-1. Sort of like Uncle Heavy, a horse that was developed in the Mid-Atlantic region, was coming out of a race at Parks. I'm guessing he was a private purchase since his last race, and now he's going out for new connections, and this was his first start for trader Michael Yates. And I'm not really sure what to say about this race because there were so many disappointing performances from shorter prices. But Frankie's Empire showed up and took yet another step forward, and didn't mind being out wide in the clear the entire way.
No, yeah, it was. He ran a 108 Timeform US speed figure, which is another step forward for him. Not one to get super excited about. I mean, it was barely faster than the Phillies version, just 5 points. The real disappointment was Legalize, who was coming in off a couple of really impressive wins that were over right around the 110 Timeform US speed figure mark. He did no running whatsoever. Not sure what happened. I mean, he was up close early and just had nothing left at all for the stretch. So not sure. Almost looked like a horse that bled. I don't want to speculate on what could have happened to him, but something clearly went wrong.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few horses dueling for the lead here, and they just all sort of petered out. I mean, Bilal, Risk It were in the mix, and they just didn't have much left for the stretch drive. And Frankie's Empire, it's not like he was that far off the pace. He was stalking with it about a length and a half of the leaders the entire way, but just looming outside of them in the 5 or 6 path, he was the one that went on with it. Even a horse like Ladom Bro, who was involved in the pace, backed off a little bit. He came back for second. He's one of those that was coming out of the Remsen, where he really was no factor that day. I think he finished 9th, but did take a step forward to run the best race of his career here. So just not really sure what to make of this one, Craig. Certainly not seeming like a Derby prep, but even as far as that 3-year-old sprint division goes, I feel like there are probably going to be better horses out there, even though this race did get a respectable 108 Timeform US speed figure. I think that was the highest number given out at Gulfstream on Saturday for the 3-year-olds, but not a race I'm getting overly excited about.
No, not at all. It's sad to see what became of the Swale. It used to be a really big race.
Let's move over to the turf course, where they ran a couple of stakes for the males and females going the same mile and a 16th distance there. The Kitten's Joy was won by First World War, a horse that was getting back to the turf here. He began his career on the grass, was 4th in the Bourbon behind Cannon Group last year. They tried a couple of dirt races, ran him in the Mucho Macho Man, where he actually put in a good effort to be second, but seemed like getting back to the turf here really agreed with him, and he also got a good trip under Tyler Gaffalione.
He did, yeah. It's hard to say which surface he's better on. He seems to be a horse that runs about the same on both. He got a 103, I believe it was, for this win, going back to the turf, which is solid for a 3-year-old this time of year. This time last year, we were talking about some really fast performances. It just kind of shows how good that crop was. And they're backing it up as we move on. But yeah, it was a good effort from him. Another one I'm not going to get super excited about. Don't know it was the strongest field we're ever going to see, but he ran fine, and I would imagine he's going to stick to turf for the time being.
Yeah, and the raw times of this race look very fast. That Gulfstream turf course on Saturday, Craig. I mean, I think it's getting a 10 on the track condition rating scale. It probably could have been a 15. I mean, it's just playing as fast as any turf course I've ever seen. So don't make too much of the raw times of this race, even though it seems like these horses are potentially coming home extremely fast. I mean, just check out the other races on this card. I mean, all of the times coming home to the stretch are just almost unbelievably fast. So I would take all of that with a grain of salt. That's why the speed figure is not as high as you might expect based on the raw time of this race. And the same is true for the Swedish Chant, which has run over the same distance for the 3-year-old fillies. Life's Inaudible, the winner of this race, Craig. She's now put forth 2 pretty good efforts at Gulfstream since turning 3 years old. She was second to Ozara when getting the tougher trip than that one of the Ginger Brew prior to this. And in this race, put in that big late run to get up on the wire, beating a decent field. But still not sure how strong any of these races are during the wintertime.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is I want to thank Gulfstream. I'm sure it was probably an accident, but these were run on the same course for a change, unlike Pegasus Day, where they put up 2 different rail settings and you couldn't compare races at the same distance. You could easily compare these. As you said, the course is super fast. This race went a little faster than the boys. Life's Inaudible got a 106, and I mean, she's pretty good. It was a grade 3 race. That's probably about what it deserves to be, but I do think this one has some talent.
Yeah, I mean the final 16th of this race is hard to believe. I think it's a product of the way they time races at Gulfstream. I would not put a whole lot of stock into that, but that's all kind of smoothed out. I know when you look at the TimeformUS pace figures. So if you're using the TimeformUS pace figures, all of that's been accounted for. And Life's Inaudible, she did put in a good late run to get up in this race, beating a horse in Style Points who got a fantastic trip. I mean, she saved ground every step of the way. The rail opened for her, and she still couldn't hold off the horse who just is simply better than her. So Life's Inaudible, she's at least flattering that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf a little bit. I mean, she was 8th in there behind some good U.S. trained runners like Hard to Justify and She Feels Pretty, who we haven't yet seen as 3-year-old. So feels like at least a vote of confidence in terms of how that field might progress into the 3-year-old seasons. But Life's Inaudible, she's obviously heading in the right direction. Let's move on to some non-stakes events from last week at Gulfstream, including an allowance race that was run earlier in the day on Saturday at Gulfstream. This one was won in an upset by Real Macho, who was able to nail the heavy favorite Born Noble on the wire. I know this race was supposed to just be a walk in the park stepping stone for Born Noble before he tried a Kentucky Derby prep, but I guess those plans are slightly derailed here with Real Macho beating him. And it just kind of felt like this was a horse that wanted the distance a little bit more than some others in this race, Craig, because the early pace, it was not that taxing, although Born Noble was pushed through some faster interior fractions by that Safi Joseph trainee Merritt, who went after him in the middle portions of this race. And Real Macho was just able to pick them both up at the end.
Yeah, it's one of those rare races where it's slow early, but as you say, the middle got pretty quick. So maybe you could get Born Noble a little bit of an excuse, but he did open up 3 lengths with a furlong to go, and Real Macho was just able to run him down, ran a 104 TimeformUS speed figure. Born Noble actually got a little higher being up on the pace, and that quick middle section wound up with a 107, and it kind of backed up his win where he ran a 106 first time out, and that race has actually come back pretty strong. It's not like that figure seems like it's overrated or anything. He just got run down by a horse who appreciated the distance.
Yeah, there was a moment in the stretch about the between the 3/16 and the eighth pole where it looked like Board Noble bobbled or stumbled a little bit. I don't know if that cost him the race, but just he didn't hit the rail or anything. It just looked like he took a bad step, something that's a little odd to see. Maybe not a great sign moving forward for him, but Real Macho was able to reel him in at the end of this race after it looked at the top of the stretch like Board Noble was on his way to victory. Real Macho, he does seem like a horse that wants the distance, Greg, even though he didn't handle his first two turn test, two back. It just seems like he's one that's progressing with each start. And the way that he was striding out to the finish line, he was the one that sort of gave off the vibe that more ground could work for him. And this race didn't come up that much slower than the Holy Bull, so I guess you could take an optimistic view of these horses moving forward. But all of these runners that participated in dirt races at Gulfstream Park on Saturday, I think they've got something to prove before they're legitimate Kentucky Derby contenders.
I would definitely agree with that.
Let's move on to Oaklawn Park and wrap up a couple of the stakes races there from last weekend. I believe the highest speed figure assigned to anybody this weekend, Craig, just above Nisos's 125 in the Robert B. Lewis, was the 126 assigned to Skelly and the King Cotton. And no big surprise there. Skelly ran some very fast numbers during the winter at Oaklawn last year, and it seems like he's come back just as good as ever, now second off a layoff for this 5-year-old season. And I wonder what Steve Asmussen is going to do with him now, because I know last year they ran him a ton during the winter and then he missed the second half of the season. He feels like the kind of horse that could win some major sprint races, but I just wonder how they're going to handle his campaign this year.
Yeah, I know both of us had some concerns about him not being able to use Lasix, but it proved to be no concern at all, as he just absolutely dusted this field. Ran a 126 TimeformUS speed figure, did it easily. I mean, honestly, he was never really challenged at any point in the race. Saturday was a really easy speed figure day to make for Oaklawn Park, and it was just one of those where he was the best horse. I mean, on paper, it looked like he was going to make an easy lead. He basically did make an easy lead, but it wasn't like he absolutely crawled on the front end. He was challenged a little bit by Excess Magic, dusted that one away, and the race was essentially over. Tejano Twist, who finished second, ran his usual good race. Skelly's actually better than what I thought he was after the layoff. I mean, we both knew he was really good last year, but had questions because he didn't really try top competition. But he did here, and I'd say he passed with flying colors.
Yeah, and I've had people say to me that the next two races we're talking about on the podcast, this one and the Martha Washington, are evidence that I'm wrong about the rail bias. Well, I would say that these are actually great evidence that there was a rail bias. Not a big surprise that Skelly was able to win this race. I mean, even racing out in the 2 to 3 path for most of the way, he's just better than these horses. And Tejano Twist closing wide over this kind of course, I mean, no surprise he couldn't get to him. But Craig, the performance of the third place finisher, Excess Magic, to me is strong evidence of a rail bias, because that horse was a long shot in this race, tried to duel with Skelly in the early stages. Most horses with the credentials of Excess Magic you would expect to just fade away and be no factor in this race. And he was actually battling back on the inside, trying to hold off Tejano Twist for second, running a career best speed figure for him. To me, the evidence of the rail bias is in Excess Magic's performance.
For sure. And I think a lot of people overlook that, where they don't look at the horses who finish back. They just focus on the winners. But I think a lot of times what you say is really important, where you look at how horses finished on the part of the track you think was best. And that was a horse who had every right to finish last after dueling with Skelly. And he dug in, and not only didn't he finish last, I mean, there were some pretty good horses who finished well behind him.
Yeah, Skelly is a really nice horse right now. Like I said, I wonder if they're going to try to aim for some graded stakes races with him. Maybe better races than Oaklawn cards during the winter time, because I know we didn't see him in a lot of the championship level sprint races last year, and he feels like the kind of horse that could be really dangerous in those. So I just wonder. I know Steve Asmussen likes to run his horses. Tough to keep running at this high level from February all the way on through November. Maybe they, for whatever reason, they don't view Skelly as a Breeders' Cup sprint kind of horse, but based on speed figures, that's the kind of race that should probably be on the calendar for him. And then we'll talk about the Martha Washington, which was the 3-year-old counterpart to the Southwest. This one, an ungraded race, but going the same mile and a 16th distance for the 3-year-old fillies. Won in a big upset by Band of Gold, who also was going out for the Ken McPeak barn, ridden by Brian Hernandez. They had a big day at Oaklawn Park on Saturday. This filly, Craig, I'll point out, she did close on the outside in the stretch, but she had ridden the rail for almost her entire trip up until the stretch drive, just saving ground every step of the way, and then angled out to run by some horses who seemed like they might be a little distance challenged.
Yeah, she ran fine. Like you said, she saved ground all the way into the stretch before tipping out to, I guess, the 2 path and then maybe a little beyond. But she ran fine in here. It was a big day for Ken McPeak. It's kind of funny, ironic for me. I picked two Ken McPeak horses. Neither one of them ran very well, but he still won 2 races on the day and won the 2 biggest ones. So good day for him. 106 TimeformUS speed figure, which is good for this crop. Not sure really what to make of this race given the surface and the possible bias, and just be more interested to see how she does going forward. I guess you could give Denim and Pearls a little bit of an excuse, as she was off the rail pretty much all the way and held on pretty well for second, but she was no match for the winner.
Yeah, I mean, a 106 is actually a pretty good number for this division right now. We haven't seen too many of the 3-year-old fillies, or even last year when they were 2-year-olds, running numbers that are much faster than that. So I guess that puts Band of Gold in the conversation as a Kentucky Oaks kind of horse. Even with the good trip, Craig, this was a big step forward for her. She hadn't run nearly as well at Fairgrounds in her stakes debut in her prior start. Denim Pearls, she was against the bias. I have some questions about how far she wants to go. She also seems to me, watching her races, like a horse that waits on competition and doesn't seem like she has the most willingness to finish off her races and win them. So that's not the best attribute for her in terms of her future prospects. So just not sure if I'm overly excited about anybody in this race, but I guess they're in the conversation at this point in time, as a lot of 3-year-old fillies are right now. Go on to a different racetrack, and we'll head back over to Santa Anita for that card where they ran the Robert B. Lewis on Saturday. A couple of other stakes that we should mention are the Thunder Road and the Santa Monica. The Grade 3 Thunder Road, going the mile on the turf, was won by Goliad, who did a bit of a Precious Passion impression here, running off in the early stages, Craig, opening up a double-digit margin on the field down the backstretch, and seemed like everybody else in the race just sort of underestimated this horse, assumed he'd come back, and he never did.
He's becoming one of my favorite horses in training. I love horses that do this. And it seems like the other riders almost get confused because we're so used to turf races that don't have a ton of pace. And he actually started out slow. The opening quarter for the Santa Anita turf course was pretty slow. And from there, he just, like you said, ran off, opened up a huge lead. And I think maybe the other riders got a little overconfident they could reel him in. But at the end of the day, he's a pretty darn good horse, and he always runs decent final time figures. And when he's on his game, he just is very tough to run down. He got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure. We don't really give any extra credit for going fast when a horse runs off like that. So it's basically the same as the final time figure, but just a fun horse for me to watch. And he's always going to be dangerous if you let him go.
Yeah, Richard Mandela was saying after this race that in the past, he feels like they've tried to get overly strategic with trying to, dole out this horse's speed. And they've kind of learned over time that the best thing to do with him is to just have the rider be a passenger. Just let him go. Don't get in his way. And if he wants to go fast, let him go fast, and he'll see it out. And that's what he was able to do here. And I think he's been able to use this running style successfully now twice in a row. I will say, Craig, there really wasn't much behind him in this race. I know he went off at 5-1. I mean, on speed figures, he probably should have been the favorite in here, although I know people didn't quite trust him based on the way he doesn't always finish off his races. But, you look at a horse like the 6-5 favorite, or 8-5 favorite, I should say, Tio Magico. I mean, he's not a horse that had run particularly fast coming in here. So if they want to try some tougher races down the road, he's going to face tougher competition. But he is a fun one to watch run.
Yeah, he kind of gives me vibes of, obviously, not, I don't think he's quite of that ability, but just the way he runs, he is a fun one to watch.
Another graded stakes on that Saturday card at Santa Anita was the grade 2 Santa Monica. This one going 7 furlongs on the dirt for the fillies and mares. And Three Witches, Craig. I mean, she backed up that third place finish at a big price in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint from last year. After that, she went immediately through the auction ring, sold for $1.7 million, and now in the barn of Michael McCarthy, and ran arguably the best race of her career to win the Santa Monica fairly easily by 2.5 lengths.
Yeah, speed figure wise, it was the best race of her career. And she's a horse who's been steadily progressing throughout her career. And Mike McCarthy obviously did a good job with her. It's been a while since we saw a 118 Timeform US speed figure from fillies and mares sprinting out west. So maybe they have a good one out there.
Yeah, I mean, for a 5-year-old, she's relatively lightly raced at this point in time. I think this was just the 9th start of her career. So she might just be hitting her best stride right now. And as you were noting, I mean, that kind of number is going to win a lot of races in this division moving on through the rest of the season. So she could be a dangerous new addition to this older filly and mare division out west. And then one more race we'll talk about from Santa Anita was a Friday maiden special weight event won by the 3-year-old filly Ultimate Authority in very fast time, Craig. I know this could not have been the easiest day to make speed figures for because it did seem like the track maybe got slower throughout the day, but did feel like, just given the margin between the second and third place finishers, this had to be a fast race. The top two opened up, I think, nearly 18 lengths on the rest of them. And Ultimate Authority, she had to battle hard for the win, but certainly looked like she's improving in just the third start of her career.
Yeah, no doubt. She has certainly improved every time out, from an 81 to a 101 all the way to a 111 this time. The gap to the rest, I don't remember what it was. It had to be close to 20 lengths. The runner-up also got the same figure, a 111, in what became a virtual match race after from like the half mile on. So very good effort. And as you noted, these are 3-year-olds. So it's a division which is looking for some horses that can run fast, and maybe Ultimate Authority and even the runner-up are among those.
Yeah, I think there are a couple other horses who have won maiden special races that have gotten fast numbers. I think that Bob Baffert horse Kinza got a fast number. I'm forgetting some others, but Ultimate Authority's 111 has to be among the fastest numbers that we've seen from anybody in this 3-year-old filly division. And she actually did it going 2 turns. So that's all a very good sign for a horse who probably is going to have stakes in her future very soon. Nice to see these connections have a good horse. These are the same connections that owned and trained Practical Move last year. Obviously, a sad ending to his story. But Ultimate Authority, actually, for the same owner and trader, is also a daughter of Practical Joke, like that one. So they've got another horse from the same sire line that appears to have real ability and could make a splash in some 3-year-old filly stakes races in Southern California this winter. Let's go on to Tampa Bay Downs, where they ran a couple of turf stakes races on their Saturday card, both grade 3 events. The last race of the day was the Tampa Bay Stakes. And, Craig, I don't want to redboard too hard on this one, but how exactly was Never Explained 9-2 against this field, given his speed figures coming in and his resume against tougher competition? It sort of boggles the mind a little bit. Maybe people didn't trust him coming off the layoff, but he ran back to some of his better races and was just too good for this field.
Yeah, he seemed like the best horse to me as well. I was kind of caught by surprise with this race because I think they used to run these races on Sam Davis Day, but it's one of those, I'm getting older. I don't keep up with the schedule, but I thought he ran even better than the margin would indicate. It was a race without a lot of pace in it. A couple of the fractions are coated in blue, and he was able to work out a trip from in behind. It was a race where the horses on the front end weren't really contenders, so maybe that helped a little bit, but he wound up with a 124 Timeform US speed figure and looks set to pick up running in graded stakes races the rest of the year, I would imagine.
Yeah, I thought it was a good ride from Vincent Cheminot, who broke from the rail, but didn't seem too concerned with getting this horse off the inside around the far turn to try to get him in that position to make his move at the top of the stretch. And you could tell from about the quarter-mile pull home that he was going to win this race. Just a question of by how much. And maybe didn't pull away the way you might expect in the late stages, but it was his first start of the season, coming off a bit of a layoff. So definitely a good effort from him. I thought Running B didn't have a huge excuse. I mean, he sort of moved moved wide around the turn and couldn't fend off the winner in the late stages. The third place finisher, Siege of Boston, did put in a good rally because he got shuffled back to last in the early stages and was closing into that slow pace, but never explained. Just looked like the best horse coming in, the best horse on the day, and the right way to start the season in a Grade 3 event, assuming that there are going to be some tougher races on the horizon down the line. And this division feels fairly open right now, Craig. I mean, we obviously had Warm Heart, that European shipper who has since been retired, win the Pegasus World Cup turf, and Up to the Mark, who seemed like the division leader last year. He has also since retired. So definitely a fairly open division for as far in terms of the Grade 1 races that'll be coming up in the spring and summer.
Yeah, I'm expecting some of the really good 3-year-olds of last year we saw to start appearing and running back to their form, but who knows? And one of the more puzzling things you'll ever see to me was Irish Aces going off the favorite in this race. I was totally baffled by that one. He ran fine, I guess, but I think that led to Never Explain being the price that he was, and just one I couldn't figure out at all.
I don't get it either, Craig. They bet this horse down to favoritism also two back in that Tropical Park Derby, where I thought it was kind of crazy against that field. And they bet him to favoritism here, which just seemed totally out of step with the form and speed figures coming into this race. Not a jockey that usually takes money. Very odd. I don't know what was going on there, but clearly it was not good information. He ran fine, but certainly not up to that kind of backing. And then the other graded stakes race at Tampa on Saturday was the Endeavor. This was a little bit earlier, the sixth race on the card. And this was won in gate to wire fashion by Walkathon, who, Craig, this horse looked so good during her 3-year-old season. And I know it must have been frustrating for her to have an injury and then be on the sidelines for so long. And it seemed last year like she just hadn't come back as the same horse. But now, a year and a half, 2 years later, it seems like she's finally getting back on track. Though I will say she had all the best of it from a trip standpoint in this race.
Yeah, she definitely did. It was a race that it doesn't have the P notation because we do build in the algorithm gives extra credit for horses who run fast, finish fast. And she did, but the early pace was just really, really slow. Early TimeformUS speed figures in the 70s. It was run at the same distance as the male version of the race. She wound up with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure, but it was one where I would say the horses who were off the pace virtually had no chance, including the two, the favorite in the race, Consumer Spending. The disappointment had to be Full Count Felicia, who really had no excuses, in my opinion.
Yeah, she was on top of that pace. It just didn't have much to offer. Seems like some of these Brittany Russell horses don't always run as well outside of Maryland as they do in her home state. But yeah, Consumer Spending feels like the one that was most compromised by the pace in here. I still would have liked to see her do a little more running on the stretch, just given some of the late finishes we had seen from her in her prior season, Craig. It seemed like she tailed off at the end of last year, and this performance doesn't exactly provide evidence that she's gotten back to her best form, but it was first off a layoff. I don't want to take too much away from Walkathon, though, Craig. She had gradually been cycling up to a better performance after being fairly disappointing coming back off the layoff. She is one of those horses that had competed in that Star Fortress race. That was the Cardinal back in November at Churchill Downs, and she was one of those that was involved in the fast pace that just kind of fell apart at the end. And I mean, she's certainly moved forward since then and kind of gives credence to the idea that maybe you wanted the pace horses coming out of that race as opposed to the last to first winner. But a nice effort from her. We'll see if she could do it with a more difficult pace scenario in a future spot.
Yeah, the one upside is it's not like she's a horse who has to have the lead. She has been able to finish races when she was in good form from a little bit off the pace. So I think it's a good sign and a really nice training job that they've been able to stick with her through what you said had to be frustrating given the talent she showed earlier in her career.
Let's finish off the Pacecast this week with one race from Fairgrounds, a venue we haven't yet visited on this week's rundown, and just a maiden race from last Thursday's card, but I think a horse with some promise, and maybe a couple of horses as the top two finishers got nice speed figures in this race. That was the 8th race from Thursday, a 6-furlong maiden special weight event for the 3-year-old fillies, won by the Phil Bauer-trained Tipsy Tammy, who was a second-time starter coming into this race, but we've been talking about how a lot of the 3-year-old fillies are not running very fast speed figures at this point in time, Craig. So you've got to consider this a pretty exciting prospect, especially given that she's a daughter of Arrogate with plenty of stamina in her pedigree.
Yeah, I was gonna say she's a horse. She did this at 6 furlongs, and everything about her pedigree would indicate that she's going to get better with more distance and with more time. And she ran a 106 Timeform US speed figure after running a 101 when running second to a promising filly named Impel first time out on New Year's Day. So this one definitely has some upside. She's one that before you even did the rundown, I have entered her in my stable mail to alert me to when she's going to run back. And I won't be surprised at all if that turns out to be a stakes race.
Yeah, one thing I did not like about this performance is that she never changed leads. She was just hanging on her left lead all the way through the stretch. That's not something you love to see in the second start of a horse's career. You want to see them start to develop a bit more professionalism, but she was able to pull away from this field regardless of that. So all a good sign there. And as you were saying, I mean, pedigree definitely suggests more distance is going to be her friend. She's by Arrogate, who has really proven to be a strong dirt route influence in the few crops that we've seen from that sire. And as far as the dam side pedigree goes, I mean, she does have one sibling that was more of a speedball type, but there are plenty of other stamina influences in this pedigree. I mean, the dam is by a Belmont Stakes winner, a Lemon Drop Kid. The second dam is actually Perfect Stig, who was the Breeders' Cup filly and mare turf winner back from the early 2000s, and kind of bringing things full circle because I believe she was trained by Joe Orsino, who now has a horse on the Derby Trail, and the first horse we talked about in this rundown today in Hades. So pretty cool tie in there, but definitely a horse in Tipsy Tammy who feels like stretching out will probably be the next challenge for her if she steps up against winners.
Yeah, and I don't want to overlook the runner-up Upon a Star, who was a first-time starter for Brad Cox. She ran 100 speed figure, and I liked what I saw from her. I'd be very surprised if she doesn't break her maiden next out. It was a big gap back to third.
Well, Craig, as we wrap up this week, I mean, we had these 4 Derby preps take place. How are you feeling about the Kentucky Derby Trail at this very early stage? Because it just feels like there's still so much to be determined. And, I'll just say I'm kicking off my Derby watch for DRF with my colleague Brad Free this week. The two of us will be talking about the Derby contenders every Wednesday. We'll put out videos. And I had to do my first early odds line on the Derby. And it kind of struck me when I was trying to set odds on these horses that there's really no standout and no clear favorite among them right now.
No, I guess you would have said Fierceness was had you already done one, but that kind of went out the window with that performance. I think there's some reasons to question Mystic Dan, as you pointed out. Hades and Uncle Heavy didn't run particularly fast, and the top 2 in the California race aren't eligible. So it's really tough. It's one I don't even really keep track until the races show up of who's coming back and who's going to return. So it's just one we'll see. We're going to have 3-year-old races most weeks going forward. So it's a picture that's just going to be constantly evolving.
Yeah, for sure. I know you're just glad I'm not asking for your top 10 list right now because I know it's your favorite thing to put together. But I think Locked is a horse that a lot of people were excited to see run next week for Todd Pletcher, but now he's out of the Sam F. Davis coming up with a temperature. So it just feels like a lot is yet to be determined on this Kentucky Derby Trail, and we'll continue to talk about it as more developments come through each week. Well, Craig, I know this is going to be your only podcast this week. You're off the rest of this week, and I believe you're also going to miss a Pacecast next week. So I'll see you in about a week and a half from now. We'll talk about that, the forecast, I think, at that point in time. I will have a guest coming on to do the forecast with me this week. I believe we're going to focus on that Tampa Bay Downs card on Saturday when they're supposed to run the Sam F. Davis. So there will be another podcast coming out this week, Craig, but just want to say enjoy your few days off.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't make it this week, but I will be listening for sure. I always like the Davis card and look forward to hearing who your guest will be.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning into the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.